Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to take this call on behalf of New Zealand First on the Social Security Long-Term Residential Care Amendment Bill, because there are one or two things I want to say about it and about the budget as a whole. And Mr Speaker, this is a penny-pinching measure symptomatic of the government's whole approach to this budget, making more elderly people in residential care pay more for their residential care and sooner by indexation of asset thresholds, and this will save very little, Mr Speaker. In the year 2012-13, $4.5 million, 2013-14, $8.4 million, 2014-15, $12.4 million, and 2015-16, $16.4 million. In terms of the government's overall budget over these years, this means actually very little. But for people in their last years of their lives, it means less access to their savings for the comforts that they should have during those years. It means earlier state dependency, and it means they are robbed of the pleasure of passing a financial legacy on to their family. And Mr Speaker, that is so important for so many of them. But this government, of course, does not in fact actually care about the elderly at all. New Zealand First, on the other hand, has a well-deserved reputation for caring for elderly and their needs. But, Mr Speaker, as I said, this is a penny-pinching budget. It attacks the most vulnerable people in our community. It does very little to stimulate the economy. It does practically nothing to stimulate exports, despite the declared objects of this government. And rather than punishing the elderly, it should try to support them further, as this community as a whole should do. New Zealand First, therefore, does have policies along those directions, including a 10% discount on power bills for them, people on gold cards, and first year free doctor's visit, and then a $10 cap for the years after that. Those are the sorts of positive policies which New Zealand First has for the elderly. And what do we see from the national government? We see not only nothing for the elderly, what we see is a policy of punishing the elderly, punishing paper boys, and also providing nothing whatsoever for the low-income people in our community. And, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister referred to Planet Labour during his speech. But the architects of this budget are from Asteroid National, a dull, lifeless rock from outer space, producing no life, no light and no warmth, especially not for the elderly in our community. And that asteroid is very much like this budget in its approach. And like an asteroid, National and this government goes endlessly around and around in circles. The underlying policies, asset sales, austerity, especially for the elderly and low-income earners, and an obsession with an early surplus for no good apparent reason are the same failed policies from the past. They didn't work in National's Ruth Richardson's budget, the mother of all austerity budgets, and they won't work now. And this Minister of Finance is like a witch doctor trying to give life to the undead, producing zombie policies, policies more dead than alive. And these policies won't work because they are really about the government's financial and political objectives. They are not about people and their welfare. They are not about communities and their viability. They are not about the elderly, who are ignored in this budget, except by being punished in the same way that we see in this particular bill. They are not about students, who will find it harder to manage their student loans under this budget. It's not about stimulating employment. In fact, Mr Speaker, without the economic windfall of the Christchurch earthquakes, thousands of short-term jobs provided by that employment under this government would get worse and worse and worse. And, Mr Speaker, it's bad enough already. Mr Speaker, this bill and this budget is all about political economics. 2 years of excessive austerity as a surrogate for genuine financial management. with all the damage that does to people young and old, as we see in this particular bill. And then, Mr Speaker, after 2 years of unnecessary pain, government plans a small surplus. This is solely for election year purposes. No doubt in that year's National will find some lollies, not for low-income people, not for the elderly, but just for National supporters only. So their approach is to punish the paper boys, to punish the elderly and low-income people, so that in 2014, 2015, there can be some lollies for National's mates. And, Mr Speaker, the leader of the government's political economics is the Prime Minister, John Key, always richer in politics than economics. He cast a dispersion on Mr Shearer when David Shearer's slip of the tongue referred to Mr Speaker as Mr Australia. But that was misdirected, Mr Speaker, because it is the Prime Minister who should be Mr Australia, because he is the principal cause of the exit of thousands of talented young Kiwis to Australia. They have no confidence in him or his government's policies, or especially in this budget. It will produce no real long-term jobs and no real growth, no worthwhile assistance with housing, and will punish people on student loans, and no mention of anything positive in this budget for the elderly at all. In fact, this bill, which only punishes the elderly, is the only reference to elderly in the entire budget. So in response to these failing policies, all we get are the tired old excuses of recession from 2008, 4 years ago, the global financial crisis, also originating years ago, and the Christchurch earthquakes. 3 tired old excuses for these failed policies. But, Mr Speaker, this government has had over 3 years to deal with the recession, and the global financial crisis has in fact had a limited direct effect on the New Zealand economy, and in fact the Christchurch earthquakes recovery is actually funded more by insurance money and, to a lesser extent, $5 to $6 billion from government borrowing. Mr Speaker, it is very, very difficult to see why measures that are set out in this bill are really required at all when you see the magnitude of the issues facing this country. The small amount of money which will be saved is penny pinching when the elderly should be more supported by our community. And this government's failed policies, relying on tired old excuses for not doing more, will not advance this community and this nation at all. And we see that right throughout the budget. It is a failed budget. It is an old-fashioned budget. It is a penny-pinching budget that we can do without.
I call Tim McIndoe.
Extraordinary contribution we've just had from that member. We've now got it on the record that New Zealand First does